Hong Kong's just had one of its biggest ever protests in history. Organisers say more than 1 million people took to the streets, 1 in 7 of the population if the numbers are right, which is simply huge. People are really worried about a proposed law that would allow extradition to mainland China. Critics have pointed out that business people and expats in Hong Kong, or even tourists going through there, could potentially, in theory, be extradited to mainland China. So the law's quite complicated, but let me try and break it down for you. The law would allow Hong Kong to extradite people to other countries it doesn't have agreements with, including mainland China. The government says there are certain safeguards, so only people accused of serious and criminal offences will be extradited. People accused of political or religious crimes won't be extradited. The government also says that each decision to extradite will be approved by a judge, but the truth is even some judges have spoken out against the laws and said they're concerned this will affect their independence. Hong Kong's a small territory in mainland China, and it is part of China, although it has its own legal system, its own judiciary and its own borders, and a lot of these systems were inherited from its time as a British colony. But China watches what happens in Hong Kong really closely. It's because China's really protective of its territory, and it probably views Hong Kong as a bit of a troublemaker where people are demanding democracy, demanding more autonomy, and China just sees that as sort of threatening. Hong Kong's no stranger to protests. In fact, it's quite famous for them. You had the umbrella protests back in 2014, and Hong Kong often has pro-democracy protests. Protests there have actually led to changes in government policy in the past, but it has become less common in recent years, and a lot of people think that's because the Beijing government has taken a harder stance now. The protests aren't being led by any particular one person. A number of pro-democracy and human rights groups have been organising the protests. On the day of the historic turnout at the protest, the term Hong Kong was censored on Chinese social media. The Chinese government has been issuing statements telling Western countries not to get involved, saying mind your own business, essentially. They've also said that the fears are overblown. Carrie Lam's the chief executive of Hong Kong, which means she leads the territory, and a lot of people feel that even though she's competent, ultimately she's answering to Beijing. There have been protests in at least 29 different cities, including London, against the treaty as well, and Ai Weiwei, the Chinese artist, actually showed up to that. He said he wanted to support Hong Kong people who'd spoken out for him back when he'd been detained in China. He, of course, was detained under tax-related offences, even though he said they were political at the time. The main slogan from these protests has been Fan Song Zhong, which are 3 words that basically translate to opposed to sending to China. People have pointed out the phrase Song Zhong also sounds exactly like another phrase, which means seeing off a dead relative. And they say that's quite apt because many people argue that this bill would mean the death of Hong Kong.